I'm Jill Cory. I work with the Emotional Intelligence Training Company. In particular, I co-facilitate the Heart and Science of Leadership for Women's course. My background was in women's health and specifically in the area of violence against women. I've co-authored a book. For the last, well, okay, I'm going to date myself, but about 3 decades, I've worked in the area of women's health and stopping violence against women. So I've worked with numbers of women's organizations across Alberta and BC and some across the country. I have been very interested in this idea of self-regard and the social construct of social ideas and values of women. So it's with interest that we start this particular webinar. I'm not an expert, but I have had a lot of exposure to women as they struggle with and kind of try to wrangle their own self-regard into place. So I think we'll just get started with the next slide. So the key messages that I want to cover today are, first of all, this idea that self-regard is a social construct. I believe that many of us have been taught to think that our self-esteem or self-regard is based on how we see ourselves, as if we're isolated individuals without exposure to social messages and the valuation of who we are. So it's very much a social construct, not an independent construct. There's a rising discourse of affirmation over the last couple of decades, and in particular, we see some of the problems with it now as we've raised our children to be rewarded for participation and rather than achievement. And of course, both are important, but we now have a generation that expects affirmation for absolutely everything. So again, that's not a problem, but it's a problem if it's not in conjunction with other ways of receiving feedback and growing as individuals. So today I'd like to problematize the notion of women's self-regard. I think historically we have made women's low self-regard the problem, but in fact, our question is the way that we've constructed self-regard the problem? And attached to that, I'd like to talk about this notion that when we say self-worth, we act as if that's one word, but in fact, they're two separate words and two really different concepts. What we'd like to see in self-regard is that we do have a sense of who we are based on our own valuation, what matters to us. But in fact, we still have so many notions coming at us about what we're worth. And that worth isn't always based on some of women's best strengths. The conundrum is, how do we, as we move forward into 21st century leaders, which value collaboration, participation, relationships, empathy, how do we begin to value the things that are often associated with being a girl and woman when historically those have been the very things that have not been valued? So that's what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a little quick self-assessment poll here, so if everybody wouldn't mind just participating. So it looks like the thing that's most difficult for others is not comparing myself to others, the statement, not comparing myself to others. And in fact, that is precisely the problem, is that self-regard or self-esteem or self-worth is about comparing ourselves to others. And historically, women have not compared favorably to men. We have valued male traits more than female traits. And we have also valued ourselves against these impossible beauty standards that are unrealistic and unattainable, but nonetheless, I think it's something that as women, maybe even more than men, we struggle with. Thank you. So does self-regard matter? Within the emotional intelligence model that we use, the EQI 2.0, it is the first of 15 competencies. And so, yes, it does matter. It matters because if it's low, if it's unfavorably low, it indicates more serious problems. You know, you kind of fall into hopelessness and such harsh self-judgment that it can be very immobilizing. So very low self-regard is problematic. And equally so, high self-regard, unstable high self-regard is also problematic. When it's low and not as meaningful in terms of having a negative impact, it's because there are other strengths that are supporting self-regard, such as strong interpersonal relationships, strong connections to social responsibility and community. So it's not a straightforward answer. I think, again, we have assumed that self-regard matters to everything else, and the research really doesn't support that entirely. So on the one side, we have high self-regard that says, no, this is a great quote from Bill, success is a lousy teacher. It seduces people into thinking they cannot lose. In other words, too high self-esteem means that they're insulated from feedback and from understanding the impact that they have on other people. And I think that is one of the major problems that I think we all have had leaders where we've seen that their high self-regard has meant that they ignore or don't, people's input and feedback and relationships don't matter to them. So in other words, they don't have to really make changes. Whereas on the left-hand side, it's a funny cartoon, you suck. I know, right? That's actually a very stable, it may be low, but a very stable self-regard where we take the feedback, we are realistic, have a realistic assessment about who we are and what our strengths and weaknesses are. And it's actually a much stronger and more stable way of being in the world. Just very quickly, this is the model, the EQI model that we use at EITC. And you can see at the very top, the first composite area that says self-perception. And that's really the three competencies or skill sets that focus on individual development, beginning with self-regard. How do we regard ourselves? What information do we take in that helps us assess and appraise who we are and how we're doing? And that's really what we're talking about today. So just wanted to put that self-regard construct in context. So what is self-regard? I'm not going to give you the answer to that, but some of the ways that we think about self-regard is, first of all, as I've said, it's a social construct. So it's knowing where those messages come from, and it's knowing how to keep messages that we disagree with further away and absorbing important messages about how we see ourselves through the eyes of other people. So it's about knowing yourself. And most importantly, it's about being yourself. I think the movement in leadership to be authentic and to really show up as a wholehearted person matters enormously. So knowing yourself is an important precursor to being able to be yourself. Perhaps the thing that women struggle with the most is accepting ourselves. If any of you are familiar with some of the Dove commercials where women talk about not liking their jaw or their mole or the wrinkles around their eyes, that we're very self-critical. And when I say self-critical, what I actually mean is we've been taught, in particular by the beauty industry and the self-help industry, to not accept who we are as we are, that there's always something that needs fixing. And we may say improving, but often it is just fixing to meet, again, these unattainable standards of perfection. And then finally being able to express who you are. So knowing, being, accepting, but finally being able to express who you are so others also know who you are. And I think along with that is know why you do things. So know what you value, what your values are, what you're passionate about, and what your motives are, what your intentions are, because part of how we do judge ourselves is whether our motives line up with our actions. So that congruency is really important. And finally, this idea about being able to bounce back, psychological resilience. Do we have within us the capacity when faced with adversity to be able to bounce back, to be able to put adversity into perspective, and to understand that it's not personal and that it's not permanent, that we can bounce back. And when we're depleted, when our psychological resiliency bank is low, I think we've all been in that place where smaller things have a larger impact on us. And that's just an indicator that at that moment, our self-regard is lower and we just don't have the resources to call on to help us through that. So just a quick, another poll. Who do you think rates themselves higher on the EQI, on self-regard, women or men? Well, that was not the hardest poll that you've ever taken, I don't suppose, but hopefully it helps your self-esteem to know that you were all right. Yes, men score themselves higher on the EQI. Which is because we tell boys and men that they are awesome. So the research, MHS is the publisher of the EQI 2.0, and their research from some time ago now shows that men rate themselves higher on self-regard than women do. But in EQI 360 research, raters rate women higher than men on every competency. So that's a very interesting, it's a perception problem rather than a reality problem. So men see themselves as having higher self-regard, but actually other people see women probably more accurately and rate them higher. There's my colleague, Jill Jameson, who I co-facilitate the Heart and Science of Women's Leadership with. When we do the course, one of the things that we talk about are the challenges that women face as leaders. And at the very top there, you see the need to be liked. Now, that is a positive quality as well as a challenge. But when we rely too much on people's feedback, in particular people that don't matter so much to us, unfortunately, it does have a negative impact on our self-regard. But you can see all the things that women balance. Family, we have a measurement system about women that is different than men. We carry unconscious gender bias. Women often feel more vulnerable. We also spend a lot of time juggling a lot of other people's needs. And at the end of the day, I think many of us feel that we haven't actually been very effective at anything that we've done. So for example, if I'm parenting, but also looking after an aging mother, and I'm a leader at work, and I'm trying to participate in my community, at the end of the day, we often feel when we appraise ourselves and our own performance that we haven't really accomplished as much as we wanted to. And I wouldn't say that we feel like we failed at everything, but often women do say similar things, that they feel like they never get enough done, they're always behind, they don't measure up simply because there's too much, there's more to do, and they just simply can't do it all. So rather than accepting that we can't do it all, I think we receive a lot of messages that we are just not good enough. And so it's part of the explanation why the self-help book industry is doing so well, is that we're always looking for a formula to try to fix what's wrong, rather than thinking that the system itself might be wrong, and that we are burdened with too many responsibilities. And again, this notion that the results are unattainable. So we've touched on, but we're going to look a little bit more at some of the highs and lows of self-regard. The I Love Me movement has been very warm, but it has resulted in some interesting outcomes. What we're looking at here is the results page of an EQI report. And if you were to do the online EQI assessment, this is one of the pages that you would get, which is a summary of the 15 competencies. So if you see right under the self-perception composite, the first item is self-regard. Now, Mary Middle is a fictitious report, so we're not looking at somebody's actual report. And she scores relatively low on self-regard. If we were to look at that in isolation, we might be actually quite worried about it. It's almost 2 standard deviations below the norm. And we would maybe worry that she was isolated, that she was feeling some despair, that she wasn't very connected. But because as I look down, I see some of her real strengths, I feel like there's enough support around her with her other strengths, that self-regard in and of itself isn't a problem. She is high on self-actualization, meaning she's doing things that are purposeful, have purpose and meaning for her. She's very expressive of her emotions, so it seems like she knows who she is and how to share her feelings. She's relatively assertive, but if you look at the interpersonal composites, she has very strong relationships with others. She participates in social activities and feels responsible in her community. She scores high in empathy. In other words, she thinks about other people, and her interpersonal relationships are very satisfying for her. So and she's very flexible, so she adapts well to change and to new things coming her way. So overall, we would say that, and Mary herself would probably say she's very satisfied or content with her life, and she accepts who she is. Now, would we as coaches or teachers want to see if there were ways that she wanted to improve her self-regard? Absolutely. But I think too often we feel like that self-regard is the indicator of how well somebody's doing. And I think this is a picture that helps us see that overall she's got a fairly strong sense of well-being. So as I referenced before, when self-regard is balanced by some of the other emotional intelligence competencies, such as social responsibility, interpersonal relationships, empathy, and reality testing, which is about really being certain by checking with other people that matter to you that you're on track with your assessment of reality, that self-regard can be balanced. So high self-regard without empathy, as you can imagine, when that's out of balance, is that we have somebody who's more narcissistic, more arrogant, somebody who's working from a kind of the saying is every man for himself. Let's just say maybe that's accurate, but every person for himself. And that they'll step on whoever they need to get where they are going, possibly. So these are possible pictures as we would only explore with the person. But we're just trying to give some indications of what happens when things are out of balance versus in balance. With reality testing, it's one of the ones that when we're not aware of our own unconscious biases, reality testing is a really important practice to make sure that what we believe to be true or accurate is shared by other people. And so that's the importance of having relationships that you trust, that you can check in with your perceptions of reality. In the interpersonal realm, which is, again, where Mary Middle scored very high, but also where women in general tend to score higher than men, it suggests that women have more effective relationships with direct peers, reports, and their manager. So again, as we move into more collaborative, team-oriented work environments, these skill sets will be very strong, both to support self-regard, but also to support women as leaders or people as leaders. So communication, which is one of the important interpersonal skills, communication is seen as the most important attribute of good leaders by both sexes. Women are more likely to perceive the skill of communication in terms of listening and engaging in two-way dialogue. In other words, this collaboration that we've been talking about, whereas men are more likely to focus on broadcasting messages as their form of communication. So again, we see that the skill set is valued by both, but the way that it's delivered is really different by gender. So some of the research says that low self-esteem is not particularly harmful. It suggests, for example, that low self-esteem is not connected to academic performance. And so we don't feel as concerned these days about a lower self-esteem, as long as it's supported by other competencies. Again, when you're coaching or supporting somebody, that's for them to decide whether they want to work on their self-regard score. And in most cases in our women's leadership groups, I think that self-regard naturally drifts upwards as we spend 3 days together, as women begin to value their own skills and what they bring both to their family and to their workplaces. They begin to reassess and reappraise how they see themselves and how they view themselves. So it's not so much that we work on self-regard as that we place their skills in a new context, in this 21st century leadership context, where they actually see and experience the value that they bring to organizations and to their relationships. In fact, high self-regard has possible downsides to it. There's an experiment, a recent experiment, where subjects were asked to administer ear-piercing blasts to a subject, and people with high self-regard were much more willing to do that than people with low self-regard. So in other words, people with low self-regard seem to have more empathy and connection to people and didn't want to harm them, whereas people with high self-regard were more willing to harm others. So obviously, a high self-regard is good as long as it's supported by more skill sets that are oriented towards relationships and caring about other people as well as themselves. Talked a little bit about this, about how the beauty industry and the self-help industry have both influenced our ideas of what are the norms that we should be attaining as women and as men. The beauty industry is a $455 billion industry. They spend a lot of money telling us that we are not okay the way we are, and that they can help us look the way that they present as the ideal woman. The self-help industry is an $11 billion industry. And just last year, there are 2,000 books offering the attainment of high self-esteem as the promised outcome. So there's a lot of money being spent on helping people feel that they are not good enough the way they are, and that we have lots of ways of helping them. So I hope by now that you see that self-regard or self-esteem, as it's often conflated with, is complex, that what we see in the women's leadership courses is that women compare themselves to others, and that they never feel that they come up to the standard that they would like for themselves or that they think is expected of them by others. And so part of the work really is to find new ways of valuing our skills. And when it's really this, what we're trying to get at today is that the very skills that we've devalued are the ones that are coming into the research as being key for the 21st century leaders. Today, I want to talk specifically about humility. But you see the list, and there's many others on the list of the research showing the most important qualities and traits of 21st century leaders. But humility, which is often, could actually show up as a lower self-regard score, is one of the valued traits of 21st century leaders. So is women's leadership style the way of the future? I do want to say that as a team, we've really struggled with how to frame the reason that we're doing women's leadership courses. It's not because we think women are more naturally oriented towards this new way of leading. It's also not because we think women need kind of rehabilitation so that they can become more command and control leaders like some of their peers or mentors. It's really because we wanted to create a space for women to talk about their leadership journey, to find ways of valuing what they bring to their workplace, and to talk about the reality that they are in, which is that they live in a 24/7 double and triple shift work environment, and often don't have a chance just to sit back and think about their own leadership journey. So we don't, some of the research might suggest that women's qualities are the qualities of the future. I believe that men have them and men can develop them, and we want that to happen too. So our leadership course is really just to create a space that we can talk about women's experiences and journey of leadership, and at the same time develop really strong outcomes and action plans to develop in areas. But the things that we do know that women bring to the table are social responsibility, empathy, flexibility, and relationship building in terms of some of the EQ items. So humility often in this context runs in a way contrary to the idea of leadership, which is that leaders know all and that they must know all and that they're above their teams, and that there isn't a two-way communication, that empathy is a bad thing at work, that you should leave your feelings at the door, and many other of those notions of more traditional leadership styles. Whereas humility reminds us, I think it was Obama that said he gets both more humble and more confident as he was in his presidency. And I think that's a very strong statement reminding us that low self-regard isn't about not being confident. It's about being real and humble and acknowledging that very little work takes place in isolation, that it requires teams, it requires, the outcomes often depend on how everybody contributes and participates, and that also that it's connected with higher aspirations, that it's not an individual aspiration, but it's an organizational aspiration or a community aspiration. So that increasingly we do see that, well, we know that participation and collaboration in work teams is an important approach and a growing approach as an accepted model. Social responsibility, I think, is an important one. In the leadership, kind of the dominant leadership model, as it becomes less popular, we see again how important creating work cultures are and creating community cultures in terms of giving back and modeling social responsibility is. We also know that in neuroscience, the notion of being of service actually creates many of the highs that we're, the serotonin levels that we might try to get from other activities such as, well, you know, wine and Netflix, for example. No. There's a growing recognition that the shared leadership is the way of the future, and that emotional intelligence skills are often contributing to that development. Again, here's, in a more anecdotal form, one of the flip charts where we ask people about some of the leadership qualities that matter and how it impacts them. You see that the things that matter to at least our groups of women is that they feel listened to, their concerns and validated, that there's empowerment of individuals and groups, that there's somebody who's carrying the vision, developing trust and integrity. And the result of that is that there's more empowerment in the workplace, that people are willing to take more risks, be more innovative, and that having some buy-in by being able to create their own vision and having it match the vision of the organization creates an energized and trustworthy work environment. So these are all skills, I think, that lead us to really knowing that we're on the right track with this 21st century leadership. So just quickly, as a final point before we go to question and answer, women in leadership are more effective than their male equivalent in taking initiative, delivering consistent results, and being role models. Women are stronger in transformational leadership, which is in the EQI leadership report, it's a transformational leadership model that we use to inspire, mentor, to coach, to bring authenticity, whereas men are stronger in transitional leadership, where they're more dominant figures, still rely on a more command and control, and focus more on results than processes. And unfortunately, we would say that the social norms and unconscious biases that men are subject to also are constrictive for them and haven't allowed men to grow and develop in ways that we hope in the future generations that we see men and women's sort of qualities being able to be more fluid, and both genders have access to the range of both emotions and actions. So that's it for the presentation. Invite you to join our 5-day self-regard challenge, and that's coming up soon. And we'd love to see you at a Heart and Science of Leadership for Women course. One is coming up in Calgary, the middle of April, Vancouver at the middle of June, I believe. So that's it for the presentation part of the session. Open for question and answers. If anybody wants to type in the chat box, if you've got questions, feel free to let us know. So first question, are you saying low self-regard is good? Yeah, we really struggled with the messaging in a short webinar like this. So we're not saying it's good, we're just saying it's not bad. I think historically we have felt like low self-regard is unequivocally bad and that we need to improve people's self-regard. And I think what we're saying is people get to decide for themselves, first of all. So if we're going to put self and worth together, that at least let the worth part be something that people decide for themselves. But more importantly, what are the other competencies and skills that people have around them that support whatever your self-regard level is? So I wouldn't say low self-regard is good, but I wouldn't say it was bad. How can women assert leadership qualities in male-dominated leadership environments? Well, if you can answer that question, you've got $1 million self-help book on your hands. I think it's very challenging, and I think that's part of the reason we love the Heart and Science course, because it actually creates an opportunity for women to speak together about what matters most in leadership, how to develop, and also to form greater alliances for adopting and implementing, and a community for adopting and implementing this, what we're calling this 21st century leadership approach. So I think one of the things that I would always encourage is that you do this in community, that doing it alone can be very challenging, and you can be somewhat of a disruptor on your own, but and you find an ally. Sometimes it's a male ally, sometimes it's a woman ally that can help support that. But in general, it is challenging to try to shift a culture that's being normed against these traditional values. And then another question that was asked was, how can I help my coworker who struggles with self-regard? That's a good question. Obviously, a coach approach is the way to do it, so that she helps to define both the problem for her as she sees it and some of the solutions. I work, as I've mentioned, I've worked in the area of violence against women, and often what comes to mind for me is when a woman has very low self-regard, I wonder what's going on in her environment. So it's not an inside job. It's really, women's self-regard is correlated highly with what's going on in their environment. So if women are struggling at home or exhausted because they're with an abusive partner or struggling with a child who's struggling, that all of those things will affect women's resiliency and women's capacity. So I guess I would show a lot of empathy and openness and take a coach approach as much as possible. And what can you do to raise your own self-regard? Again, I think, look at your other strengths, first of all, do some reality testing with other people. And, but most importantly, I would say, start to understand a little bit more about that inner critic that sits on your shoulder that tells you that you're not good enough, that you need fixing, that you're never enough. And ask yourself, where did those beliefs come from? And how you might fight back against some of those beliefs and reframe them so that you actually put yourself in a realistic way. I mean, for sure, when we're realistic about ourselves, it should reflect in a higher self-regard. So it's not about being perfect, it's about accepting who we are, the way we are, and then deciding what we want to change and taking on some steps to change it. So it's not really about a goal of perfection, it's really a goal of acceptance and a growth mindset. So where do I want to change? And I would just encourage you to make sure that it's a change that you want to embrace, not one that you feel is a more socially constructed expectation. So those are some of our thoughts on self-regard today. Are there any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining, and I hope you join us for another webinar in the future. Goodbye for now.